Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Simpson. I'm the chair of the English department, and on behalf of the English department and the Society of Fellows, I welcome each one of you here to celebrate our friendship with Dan Arvin. Dan possessed an extraordinary cognitive feature, even in his extreme old age, which... Please sit down. That's all right. Not at all. Dan possessed an extraordinary cognitive feature, as I say, even in his extreme old age, and that's what I call his radar bandwidth, by which I simply mean the width of his attention. Sit with Dan in a room, and he was conscious of a 360 radar of everything that was happening in that room without losing his focus on his particular interlocutor. That was true not only of Dan in a room, but it was also true of Dan with regard to America and the entire world for most of the 20th century. He had a 360-degree radar width. He was profoundly alive to his circumstance. He was taking it all in. So I guess each one of us now can very easily imagine Dan's face taking us in right here and now, scrutinizing us with that wry, affectionate, skeptical gaze, saying he really didn't want all this fuss to be made over him. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He didn't want to be a bother. A bother. How far was anything one ever did for or with Dan a bother? How much it was always a privilege, a delight to see that smiling face, to enjoy that glorious conversation. How do you do? And away one would go. In concert with Dan's family, we've shaped an event that focuses less on us and more on Dan himself. Much as it would have been a pleasure to hear the memorials of everyone in this hall, and we all have them, we decided instead to hear the voice that can't now, for the first time in 45 years, be heard in person at Harvard. That is the voice of Dan himself, ranging from 1943 to 2015 in passages chosen by our readers. The program will last just over 1 hour. On behalf of the English department and the Society of Fellows, I thank Dan's family for their help in shaping this event. I thank our readers. I thank our pianist, Emily Brother. And I thank each of you for coming to share our joy that we had the immense good fortune and good luck to know Dan Arvin. A practical point, I've been asked to request that you turn your mobile phones, cell phones off. Thank you very much.
Cincinnati, Queen City of the West, 1819 to 1838. Preface. It's hard to recall, after a lapse of 50 years, how this study of Cincinnati got started. I had just enrolled in the newly established American Civilization program at Harvard University and was looking around for a congenial dissertation subject, one that would invite interdisciplinary experimentation. The story of Cincinnati's rapid exfoliation from frontier outpost to thriving commercial center was sufficient in itself, but I also had ulterior objectives. Steeped in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, my Bible for the past several years, it occurred to me that a study of the values and attitudes of the Cincinnatians might offer a test of his generalizations about the American character and institutions. If I had any model, it was Robert and Helen Lynn's Middletown. I thought it might be possible to do the equivalent for a community that had flourished a century earlier. Needless to say, this was a rash assumption. The finished thesis was accepted without a request for revision and without enthusiasm by my faculty readers, one of whom must have regarded it as an object lesson of what can happen when disciplinary boundaries are willfully transgressed. Still, in partial defense of my junior self, I must confess that I read the dissertation again after a hiatus of a half-century with as much qualified pleasure as anxious attention. It is full of pertinent and lively quotations, both in the text and footnotes, and catches, I think, something of the antebellum Cincinnati's bumptious vitality. In any event, I feel an affection for my first major scholarly effort, despite its manifold imperfections, and am not sorry that it has been disinterred. From Chapter 9, Domestic Manners. The Western Museum, the most famous in Cincinnati and widely known outside the Queen City, had been organized as a public institution for the preservation of Western curiosities. But the character of the museum gradually changed under Joseph Dorfoy's ministrations until it became a kind of indoor circus stuffed with trumpery. Dorfoy himself was a learned man. He's supposed to have done some research into parasitical insects, and his scrapbook reveals an interest in conchology, paleontology, and geology. But it soon became clear to him that people would not pay to see a purely scientific collection. When he took over the Western Museum in 1823, he did it with the knowledge that Cincinnati would not support cultural enterprises. He saw that the museum filled with mummies, wax figures, and monstrosities drew the crowds. Citizens paid to see a mermaid, clumsily constructed, an armless woman, or an enormous elk. Dorfoy discovered, but not to examine, a cabinet of minerals. Dorfoy revived the Western Museum by supplementing the marine shells, Indian trinkets, and fossils with new attractions, and by so doing he proved himself a showman as well as a person of taste, science, and politeness. He added the optical paradox, or penetrative perspective, which made objects visible through an opaque body. He introduced enchanted mirrors, a magical box, a kaleidoscope, and the head of a New Zealand chief, preserved and beautifully tattooed by the cannibals of New Zealand. Finally, he presented a series of waxwork figures and tableaux, which, according to Michel Chevalier, afforded a delicious agitation to the nerves of young Cincinnati girls in quest of that excitement which a comfortable and peaceful, but cold and monotonous manner of life denies them. Dorfoy's wax figures, executed in a superior style and dressed up with great taste and elegance, showed Marat collapsing under the dagger thrust of Charlotte Corday, Charlotte Temple sitting disconsolately holding an infant in her lap and a letter in her hand, a beautiful woman sleeping on a couch while an infant, under the care of a small child, plays at the foot of the couch, most touching sight. The Empress of Russia in her robes of state, and various other characters. Dorfoy followed up this triumph with his most famous presentation, The World to Come, or as it was popularly called, the Infernal Regions. Suffice it to say that the Infernal Regions remained popular until the museum burned in 1840. There is great ingenuity and taste displayed in the arrangement of the scenery, one critic recorded, and on the paintings. The view is calculated to awaken serious but not unprofitable reflections. The transformation of the museum from a scientific institution into a place of popular amusement was completed by 1838. A Cleveland newspaper, disturbed that the enlightened people of Cincinnati delight in the horrible, commented, "Seriously, the Western Museum is a disgrace to Cincinnati and the whole West. Such exhibitions are fit only for the barbarous ages, and it appears strange that the proprietor should find support or countenance in a city of the reputed high character of Cincinnati for intelligence, refinement, and morality."
Since I think of Dan as a great sketcher of other people, presidents, writers, friends, I'm going to read you two portraits that Dan did in his writings in the 1940s. And by extrapolation, I hope there'll be a third portrait there, that of Dan himself as a young thinker and a young writer. As he talked about his book, Cincinnati, when he looked back at it at the time of its publication, he said, "I had a great desire to locate in American social history the roots of a national radical tradition. Hence, I found the books and articles of class-conscious progressive historians like Charles Beard, Carl Becker, and above all, V.L. Parrington's main currents in American thought, especially apposite for my purpose. Their ideas and presuppositions are detectable in the dissertation, and so is the watered-down and hardly perceptible Marxist strain diffused in the narrative movement from the material base of the society to its superstructure." Instead of the research that the great sociologists of his day did, he has to admit that my answers to all the questions I asked were largely based on unsystematic samplings. For example, the attitudes of the Cincinnatians I kept referring to tended to be extrapolations from the written words of their alleged articulators. I did manage, however, to create at least a simulacrum of the social order by singling out nearly 200 prominent citizens and indicating their place of origin, denominational affiliation, business, profession or occupation, and degree of involvement in civic affairs. His first portrait in this book is, of course, the new archetype, the American businessman. Self-made men, for the most part, they possess the greatest confidence in their own abilities and in the future of their land speculations. Although, like their fellows in other Western communities, they enjoyed a reputation for rashness and imprudence and were noted for their readiness to embark on large and hazardous operations, the most astute among them tempered speculative tendencies with prudence and chose a slower but safer road to wealth. In a growing city like Cincinnati, at least in the early decades, it was not difficult to achieve a modest success. He pictures the arrival as an ideal type. The young aspirant with Franklin's maxims fresh in his mind takes a position as clerk in a large wholesale produce firm. In a few years, he invests his savings, supplemented by loans from his older brother, in a consignment of pork, and with the profits derived from this venture, he purchases a lot in the suburbs. The panic almost ruins him in 1819, but he still manages to buy some choice lots, which his bankrupt fellow citizens have been forced to sell at prices far below their real value. From a small speculation of this kind, he opens a grocery store of his own, establishes a brokerage firm, or goes into the pork business. He also owns part interest in 3 steamboats, a flour mill, an iron foundry, and collects rent from a store on Front Street. In 1826, he marries the daughter of a well-to-do manufacturer of sugar machinery who had come with his family from Scotland in 1820. Nominally a Presbyterian before his marriage, he now, at the instigation of his pious wife, attends the Reverend Mr. Wilson's church regularly. At the bottom of this page, Dan lists 1 year of the budget of this businessman, a budget of $1,440.93. House rent, $275. Wages for domestics, $84.87. Window blinds, $20.37. Cushion for church, $5.25. Shaving, $6.50. Boot blacking, $8.50. School expenses, $8.60, roughly the same as boot blacking in this case. Miscellaneous expenses, $330. Yearly subscription to reading room, $4. Wood and coal, $67.50. Ice cream and soda water, $5.25. Fines and taxes, $250. Medicine, $17.50. Looking glass, $21. Groceries, $199.18. And amusements of all kind, a paltry $21.25. This kind of detailed history is what Dan dove into as he wrote his Cincinnati book, and it underlies the portrait of this businessman. The second portrait, the intellectual antagonist of this America of businessmen, his portrait of Brooks Adams in 1948, called An Essay on the Mind of Brooks Adams, The Unusable Man. Brooks Adams had been dead for more than 20 years now, but there are still many people in Boston and Cambridge who remember this eccentric and arrogant man, the last of the children of Charles Francis Adams to survive. His nephews and nieces recall his gruff manner, his penchant for saying shocking things at dinner parties, his love of argument, his endless jaunts to watering spas, his fondness for Scottish lays he compelled his niece Abigail Adams to memorize. To some people, it seems he was known as a crank, that damn fool Brooks, and Boston never quite accepted the man whom, during the fiery days of '96, it had ostracized as a dangerous incendiary. Even his brother Henry, certainly closer to Brooks than to any other member of his family, saw a mulish streak in the youngest Adams, continually cautioned him not to kick so violently against the obnoxious aspects of American life. Brooks never became resigned to anything, no matter how vehemently he boasted to Henry that he had. He remained the rebel the unreconstructed individualist, knowing all the time that he was an anachronism, an unusable man, as his niece put it, preaching to incomprehending ears. The few times in his life when he did manage to interest a small audience always astounded him. "I have not been morbid, crazy, or ill," he declared. "This is the cry of the unusable man, the prophet in the wilderness. And it is only after we have discovered more about this misplaced American that we can understand his despair." He ends his portrait with this short statement. Brooks Adams died in 1927, the same arrogant, blunt, audacious man he always was, with a few years to spare before the crack-up he anticipated and had hoped to escape. With him died his prejudices that were later to crop up in uglier forms and his yet unfulfilled predictions. He had wanted to serve his countrymen, for he never seemed quite able to resign himself to the pessimistic implications of his own message. But they responded neither to his promise of national glory nor to his threats of disaster. He had much to suggest that was pertinent and valuable, but he always stood aloof from the democracy he wanted to save and believed that men were doomed eternally and hopelessly to contend against a blind and purposeless universe. And yet he did not gloat over the world's destruction, as Henry Adams liked to do. He made a great show of being fatalistic and of enjoying the Gotterdammerung. But behind the facade of scientific detachment can be discerned a prevailing sympathy for man in his uneven contest with nature. And with those hopeful final words, Dan Aaron draws back, refusing to believe in the unredeemable and sour radical vision, saving Brooks Adams against his will from himself and his unusable vision.
I'll read 3 paragraphs from Men of Good Hope, a story of American progressives. Dan began it in 1947 on a Guggenheim Fellowship. It was published by Oxford University Press in 1951. It's a wonderful book. It's 9 portraits, each of chapter length, each as good as the 2 passages that Phil just read. It begins, it's framed out by 2 chapters, one on Emerson, whom Dan identified as the protean figure of American progressivism, and a second one on Theodore Parker, his disciple, and the man Dan identified as the link between Emerson and the post-war reformers, who the book is about. They are Henry George, Edward Bellamy, Henry Demarest Lloyd, William Dean Howells, Thorstein Veblen, 5, and 2 pseudo-progressives whom he identified in the 20th century as Brooks Adams and, better known still, Theodore Roosevelt. The passage I'm going to read is the conclusion of the essay on the portrait of Veblen. I do that because Dan, 40 years later, 40 years after the appearance of the book, was trying to get the Library of America to publish a volume of collected Veblen. He'd even found a perfect editor for it in Leonard Silk, the economics columnist of the New York Times. Silk was himself an economist before he was a newspaperman, and he loved Veblen so well that he'd written a play about him. He's a rich character in his youth. But Silk died at 77 in 1995, way too early, and the project was lost. It's still there, and I hope LOA will pick it up. Dan concludes, when a man feels strongly about the bad state of the world and wants to put his feelings into words, he can convey his disapproval and his suggestions for amendment in an infinite number of ways. He can spoof or debunk. He can expatiate warmly and tolerantly. He can fume, tabulate, preach, lament. The vehicle he chooses for self-expression will depend partly upon the personal makeup and partly, perhaps, on the degree of concern he feels for the situation he wants to remedy. Thoreau, hostile to the values of his generation and holding fast to what his contemporaries, had they read him, would have regarded as an incomprehensible position, spoke with measured force and insolent assurance. Obligated to no one and unintimidated by public opinion he habitually disregarded, he affronted the world, his world, with impunity. Requiring no elaborate subterfuges, he subverted society in broad daylight. Veblen could not afford to make the frontal assault. As an angry recluse and mocking Prometheus, he required a style and vocabulary that would muffle his rage and allow him to stalk his victims without their being conscious of his intentions. His milieu was the university, ostensibly dedicated to the quest for truth, but guided in actuality by, Veblen's words, meretricious subservience to the Philistines. Veblen can be said to have betrayed the betrayers by thinking unholy thoughts on holy ground, and by using the ritualistic paraphernalia of scholarship ordinarily employed in buttressing the social order and impressing the gullible for profoundly subversive purposes. Had he been a cynic or a debunker, content to shock and to smash images, he could have been dismissed as a troublesome smart aleck. But Veblen was too much of a moralist and a conspirator. He diverted his readers while he systematically undermined their social order. He attacked the institutions and culture of capitalism while at the same time laying the foundations for a more humane and natural way of life.
I'll read an excerpt from Dan's introduction to Emerson, a modern anthology. My husband, Bob Scanlon, chose this selection of Dan's because even though Dan wrote it of Emerson, it seemed to Bob equally true of Dan. The truth is that Emerson is one of the supreme examples of a kind of literary genius which is nearer the actual life of the mind, nearer to what really goes on inside of us all day long as thinking, than what is forcibly created by an act of will in dramas or novels. Life, Emerson says, consists of what a man is thinking of all day. And while this thinking is not as obvious as the doing that we observe in the novel, the thinking is in the actual process of life, what we are nearest to. It is the first screen on which life is reflected, our own minds. In an age which has turned away from external realism in all the arts, which recognizes the prime importance to human affairs of symbol and myth, of the unconscious residue in us, of forces which speak to us through the mind and nowhere else, Emerson's conception of man as constantly knowing, seeking, perceptive, inward dwelling is particularly recognizable and illuminating. He believes that life is thought, that man is a reflective, noticing, seizing creature. For above all, he believes in welcoming the thoughts that rise up in our minds, no matter how odd, disturbing, and unexpected they may seem.
This comes from the opening of part one of Writers on the Left, Dan's book of 1961. American literature, for all of its affirmative spirit, is the most searching and unabashed criticism of our national limitations that exists, the product of 150 years of quarreling between the writer and his society. The social criticism of writers, both the open and the veiled kind, has usually sprung from an extreme sensitiveness to the disparity between ideals and practices, but it has also reflected the hostility of the artist to a world that slights his needs and holds his values in contempt. The American writer, of course, has shared many of the convictions of his audience, and like the members of other minority groups, has shown signs of self-hatred and guilt for his failure to measure up to the national ideal. Reared in a society honoring action rather than contemplation, a society distrusting any effort, intellectual or physical, that served no obviously useful purpose, the writer was sometimes hard-pressed to justify his occupation. He had not only to reckon with the indifference of the average man engrossed in the problems of everyday living, he had also to face the clerical and religious bias against the unsanctified imagination. Hence, the 19th century American writer sermonized in his poetry and fiction. Lest his public condemn him as frivolous, if not subversive, he presented himself in the role of secular priest and often chose literary forms, the religious treatise, the humorous dialogue, the educational essay, the political tract, among others, best suited for inspiration and instruction, as well as for entertainment. From its beginnings, American literature has been hortatory and didactic, a literature of exposure, of the first person, and although the moral tone becomes less obvious and persistent after the mid-19th century, it never disappears. The didactic note sounds not only in the angry protest novels that have periodically aroused a lethargic public since the days of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but also in the less evangelical and more truly dangerous novels, like Huckleberry Finn, where the moral burden is masked in genial humor. Paradoxically, the American writer's running quarrel with his society, his natural inclination to admonish and to castigate in the guise of entertainment, may have sprung as much or more from his identity with that society as from his alienation. He has never been easy during his rebellious moods, never able to divorce himself from the cowards, scoundrels, and vulgarians he attacks. Indeed, the very intensity with which insurgent generations of rebels have assaulted the unkillable beliefs of the bourgeoisie suggests an attachment to their enemies the rebels themselves have hardly been aware of. Made bitter by rejection and despising a milieu so uncongenial for the creative artist, the aberrant or misfit writer still yearns to be reabsorbed into his society, to speak for it, to celebrate it. And the history of rebellious literary generations, which is in one sense the history of the writer in America, is a record of ambivalence, of divided loyalties, of uneasy revolt.
I'm going to read three of my favorite passages from Dan's Polish journal. It's unpublished, as an example of the many riches that are in Dan's papers, which are now at Houghton Library. Many of you know that Dan loved writing poems. He would spell it P-O-M-E-S. So the first two selections are poems from Dan's Polish journal. December 16, 1962. Said Peeping Tom to Doubting Thomas, can a liar keep his promise? Are women whom I spy through glass, as soft as cotton, hard as brass? Is the cop who hauls me in himself completely pure of sin? Tell me, friend of Christ, about it. Said Thomas with a groan, I doubt it. March 14, 1963, to Karl Marx on his anniversary. Now the world pulsates with hate. There is no justice in the state. The trek of peace is lined with lies, and hate wells up in histories. Hate and envy, rage and fear deflate the world year after year, while at the crossroads sorely pressed, truth's ostracized by East and West. And the final one is a vignette from the journal. It's full of these beautiful vignettes. March 17, 1963, Radość. Two men seated at the next table. One, a ravaged hawthorn face, close-cropped hair and the livid mark of a scar on the thin, refined skull. The face unshaven, gray stubble. Dressed in old company clothes. A long glass of vodka in front of him, beer chaser. The companion, solicitous, quiet, worried. Big mustache, dressed in leather overcoat. Sad, heavy, weepy eyes as he gloomily surveys his outrageous friend, whose mutters blossom with shouts against the militia, the Bolsheviks, Russia. I must teach these militia with their Russian uniforms righteousness. Every other word a curse. As he talks in the air to his friend, to himself, his companion tells me he's worried by his friend's indiscreet comments that the man is just visiting him. He comes from Gdansk. He suffered a head injury during the insurrection. but his friend is a doctor of philosophy, a kind and wonderful man, a former professor. The man swears again, rises unsteadily, puts his cap on at a rakish angle, fills his canteen with vodka, gives me a beautiful smile, and leaves with his solicitous friend.
Dan's introduction to the essays of Newton Arvin, whose colleague he was at Smith, and many of his remarks about Arvin seem to me to apply to Dan's own writing. So with a few, what shall I say, edits, this is a summary of Newton Arvin's work as an Americanist at Smith. What he exhibited in his lectures, and even more in his literary criticism, was a love of good writing that distinguished him from the average run of dry as dusts. With all of his painstaking accuracy and his respect for careful research and intellectual tidiness, he believed that the scholar must love not only the facts, but the words he found for them. Nor could style be applied to the facts like a coat of calcimine, a laying on of paint at the last moment, as he once observed. Bad writing, he once said to me, is a kind of immorality. He could be exceedingly testy in his private comments about the turgidity and pretentiousness of some of his fellow critics, just as he could be impressed to the point of despair by the clarity and force of critics he admired. His own aesthetic criteria emerge in the terms of praise he applies to them: range of comprehension, richness in reference and analogy, quiet responsibility, justice. After reading such men, he wrote once in a letter, "What is there left for us minnows to do?" Then he went on to say, "Of course, I know the serious and adult answer to this." Taking his large output of writing as a whole, it must be conceded that he attempted no full-dress essays on major writers like Eliot, Pound, Stevens, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, or Faulkner. But his writing presents, nonetheless, the response of an alert and restless intelligence to almost a half-century of American experience, and as such is of considerable interest to any intellectual historian. The enduring works of Newton Arvin are his books and essays on 19th century American writers. Whether he took up minor figures like James Whitcomb Riley or the giants of the Golden Age, Arvin discussed them with discrimination and authority, neither overestimating their significance nor failing to do justice to their special gifts. He never became a cultist or an uncritical apologist for things American. At the same time, he knew and relished American letters, diaries, and personal narratives, as well as the work of neglected or forgotten writers, like that crowded the literary landscape of his good friend and mentor, Van Wyck Brooks. Brooks, after World War II, had fallen under the ban of stern academic professionals and certain urban critics who resented what they considered his parochialism. But to Newton Arvin, Brooks remained, as William Ellery Channing did to Emerson, our bishop. If Brooks, Arvin wrote, was sometimes perverse when he speaks of writers who have offended something deep and personal in him, he's the only man we have who can tell off the pedants as they need to be told off. Newton Arvin's career had more than its share of painful interruptions. There were moments when he believed he would never write again, when life itself seemed insupportable, and yet soon after, preserved by a toughness and resiliency, he would be back at his uncluttered desk. These shattering intervals confirmed for him the force of Emerson's reflection. He has seen but half the universe, who has never been shown the house of pain. Pleasure and peace are but indifferent teachers of what it is life to know. He was expressing his own variation on that theme when he wrote, "The staple of life is certainly suffering, though surely not its real meaning. and we differ mainly in our capacity to endure it or be diverted from it. I myself never found it consoling to have this denied or minimized. It seems to me to give one some strength just to know that pain is normal and disappointment the rule and disquiet the standard, and that the things that have the other quality, work, friendship, the arts, are the wonderful, incredible exception and mitigation. And I can tell you from a fund of experience that one can be taken down from the rack, closer to death than to life, and then still have the most exquisite joys ahead of one. He, Arvin, spent many hours on the rack, but his writing hardly shows a trace of that suffering. It is never jaundiced or misanthropic. It never succumbs to what he called the cant of pessimism. Not that he shunned the dark side of literature. He was fascinated by Gothic revelations and reports from the pit. Frisson was one of his favorite words. But he reserved his most positive praise for the exemplars or celebrators of the human spirit, who in the midst of tragedy are still affirmers of life.
Some of the best times I had with Dan were spent discussing Arthur Inman and his notorious diary, and all the people at large in its pages. And so I'd like to read from American Notes Dan's explanation of how he got sucked into this. I took on the job because of my great fondness for diaries. Rather soon I regretted my decision, depressed by the sheer magnitude of the task and by the spoiled, prejudiced, manipulative, sadomasochistic, self-pitying author, sequestered for a good part of his life in the heavily curtained room of a seedy Boston apartment hotel. But over the years, Arthur developed into a powerful narrator and observer, at once comic and preposterous in his unquenchable lust for fame. I felt an obligation to make him famous, and I believed that my haphazard excursions in American history and literature, not to mention the fact that Inman's diary covered a period of years in my own lifetime, made me a legitimate interpreter of the man and his moment. Editing the diary helped me to put into perspective the long foreground, as Emerson would say, of my own career. And here, from the published volumes, are Dan's, the editor's, descriptions of two of the diary's central characters. Eddie Sims, chauffeur, manservant, counselor for all occasions, first hired as a driver in 1918, one of the most important characters in the diary and hardest to believe, claims to have been a professional ice skater and crack baseball player who pitched for the Philadelphia Athletics, and to have driven for Diamond Jim Brady and Lillian Russell, serves as Arthur's guide and henchman, defends him against his parents, flogs his verse and music, inculcates in him bare-knuckle philosophy for survival. Fired in 1924 after his lies and peculations become intolerable. Arthur never forgets this red-nosed, sanguine, green-eyed discourser upon life who builds up his ego and gives him a code of conduct utterly at odds with what he has been taught to believe. And to conclude, here's Dan's description of the role he grew into. Editor, unknown person Arthur addresses throughout the diary, who will bear the responsibility of shaping and preparing manuscript for publication. Arthur furnishes him with a running series of directives and admonishes him not to cut out shocking or indecorous details, lest the honesty of the work, its most essential ingredient, be impaired. At once insider and outsider, the editor gradually changes from detached observer to engaged commentator to one-man chorus.
I want to read the conclusion to Dan's essay on Nixon as literary artifact. There is little evidence to justify the claim that the authors of novels about American presidents have seen farther and dug deeper than historians and biographers, nor is it likely that some 21st century Dreiser will patiently and without scorn convert the yearnings and frustrations of Richard Nixon into another American tragedy. He has been set to music in a minimalist opera and is the protagonist in an Oliver Stone film now in the making. But should he again tempt another fictional treatment, I offer some thoughts on what it might contain. My Nixon scenario frames an anti-epic. It doesn't retell his life from his early mud-splattering campaigns to his hunting down of Alger Hiss to Watergate to his anticlimactic interment. Those episodes are better suited to documentaries and splashy movies. Instead, it focuses on aspects of himself he is reticent about or sugars over or omits entirely in his memoirs. His ménage, his odd circle of intimates, his ambiguous relations with persons he catered to, used, placated, feared, admired, hated. Dwight Eisenhower, his hope and bane, is a central player in the narrative. Nixon flatters him fulsomely and proclaims him his political father,
only to be stung by Ike's joshing rudeness and his reluctance to give him an unqualified endorsement. Eventually, Eisenhower, whom Nixon in a moment of exasperation once called a senile son of a bitch, is coerced into a public and politically expedient modus vivendi cemented by his grandson's marriage to Nixon's formidable daughter. He testifies to Nixon's political courage and boldness and pays him some left-handed compliments without ever treating him as one of his cronies. Their sadomasochistic negotiations are a recurring theme. My hypothetical and fragmentary Nixon novel is a construct of discrete dramatic occasions, some of them already sketched by such writers cum journalists as Mary McCarthy, Gore Vidal, and George Higgins. A good many derive from Nixon's dealings with his court minions, bully boys, and what he called heavy hitters. Prominent among the last are Spiro Agnew, transformed by the satirists into a mere oaf, but shown to be a trusty henchman, exploited and then abandoned by his faithless boss, the wily jack-in-the-box and White House fixer Alexander Haig, and the fawned-upon John Connolly, Texas condottiere, whose flounce and savvy and macho manner delight the president. And, not the least, Nixon's foreign policy advisor Henry Kissinger, who ingratiates himself with the leaders of rival Republican factions and keeps the White House hopping with his tirades and tantrums. He and Nixon make an incongruous duo, mutually dependent, vying for the limelight, and collaborating perforce with mixed annoyance, contempt, and admiration. The fictional Richard Nixon of my fancy has yet to be studied detachedly by the literary prosecution. Lurking in the shadows of their collective indictment is the self-designated leader of the free world, only half aware of his duplicities, hugging his illusions, hoping until the end to be seen as he saw himself, a representative American. Plainly, this Nixon isn't framed for mighty tragedies, but he might very well do as the serio-comic protagonist of a modern mask or mock-heroic epic. Hungry for advancement and recognition, he smacks a little of the Malvolio, who shouts at his persecutors, "I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you," of Tartuffe wearing his virtuous clothing, of Volpone without his poetry or libido, of young Mr. Bliffle in Tom Jones, or, as others have noted, of Uriah Heep. Writers have been too outraged by the Nixon of the dirty tricks to ponder sufficiently the sources of bottom dog Nixon's fierce aspiration to put money in his purse and become more powerful than the social elitists and intellectual snobs who scorned his origins and his culture. He deserves a novelist who can savor his brassy effronteries, his moments of frazzled grandeur, and the pathos of his untragical fall.
I'm going to read a very brief excerpt from an essay that Dan wrote about the Salzburg seminar. Very few probably remember the seminar, but it was started at Harvard in the immediate post-war period in 1947, actually by Harvard graduate students. And the idea was to acquaint Europeans with American life and culture, reacquaint. As Dan points out, some people might have called this cultural imperialism. My friendship with Dan was not based on the study of texts, and so I'm particularly grateful to Don Fanger, who suggested this passage to me, and I accepted his idea immediately. Dan was on the faculty of the seminar, and people came from all over the United States to teach from 1949 to 1965. And as many of you would have guessed, today, of course, the seminar is no longer focused on America, but is global. Everything is global today. Let me just read a couple of passages from Dan's description of the early days of the seminar. he says most students liked and respected us and believed in our good intentions. You've got to remember that the students were shooting at each other a few years ago. They also believed, or so it seemed to me then, that most Americans, to be sure with notable exceptions, tended to be naive, simple, and transparent compared to their European counterparts. We were too eager to please, and we smiled too much. He also says, our job as we saw it was to explain the USA and not to sell it, and we were ready to flaunt its blemishes and its blessings. And another very few lines, it was not always clear whether their fascination was inspired by social concern or by an impulse to puncture American triumphalism. This was in the 1940s, and here is the brief passage from a slightly later period. By 1956, the USA was old hat to consumers of American popular culture and gleamed less brightly than it had when the seminar was new. The subject of the February-March session was, quote, writing and publishing in American society. Of the 4 faculty members, I, Dan, was the only bona fide academic. 2 were freelance journalists and social commentators of long standing, the third an economic historian and specialist on the publishing industry, an unprofessional crew in speech and demeanor, and decidedly unboosterish. A Scots participant wondered at the end of the session if the lectures hadn't been a little overcritical of American pastimes and institutions, especially Dwight MacDonald, whose highly subjective approach and pronounced views on American mass culture offended, delighted, or puzzled his listeners. Certainly, their professors in Helsinki, Oslo, Paris, Milan, Mannheim, Berlin, and Aarhus didn't argue unceremoniously with their students. And if they had chosen to lecture on the cultural implications of packaging consumer goods in America, would they have likened the difficulty of unwrapping a bar of soap or chocolate to undressing a woman? Probably not. MacDonald, they concluded, was unacademic but stimulating. Not long thereafter, the seminar sessions shrank from 4 weeks to 2 weeks, and mavericks like MacDonald were out of sync with its increasingly corporate and political image. The gradual displacement of enthusiastical types crazy enough to have conceived the Salzburg project kept the seminar from going under, as it surely would have done without the intervention of practical administrators and infusions of cash. The seminar broadened the scope, sharpened its focus, enhanced the role of business and social sciences. Something engagingly amateurish disappeared in the process, an atmosphere of spontaneity epitomized for me by the music and words of Brecht and Weill, Threepenny Opera, whose scores we had memorized in the summer of 1949, and in the recordings of Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong that I had brought from Paris. Years later, Louis Armstrong announced that he was taking his band to Moscow, quote, to bruise those cats with happy music. In a less stunning way, I suppose that was what we were hoping to do in Austria, taking care not to omit the blue notes and minor chords. Lest we appear like happy Americans, unscathed by life, we feigned a cosmopolitanism we hadn't earned, and we consciously avoided any appearance of trying to win friends and influence people. Few of us, I'm sure, gave much thought to how we might figure in the larger purposes of American diplomacy. So far as I knew, the Salzburg staff and faculty had no ties with the makers of American foreign policy and would have hooted at the charge had it been made.
Dan and I used to vote together frequently at his polling place off Longfellow Park, and I wanted to share some of his reflections on the political lives he observed, collected in The Americanist. I'll follow the order of 4 characters as they appear in the book, 3 presidents and 1, fortunately, not. First, Dan's explanation of presidential elections. When I first became aware of them, presidents were majestic eminences, but fashioned out of common clay. National myth assured us that anyone with the right stuff, girls accepted, of course, could rise to the highest office of the land. Of course, I never gave Negroes or Jews any chance to be chief magistrate when I first began to consider such matters. Presidential elections recurred like national holidays, and for a long time seemed of less moment to me than heavyweight title fights or the World Series. Only after the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 did I regard them as crucial contests that could well determine the future of the Republic. All the same, my friends and I always saw presidents as emblems of power and authority. Hence, we would challenge one another. Who do you think you are, President of the United States? One day in early autumn 1936, I saw President Franklin Delano Roosevelt plane. His open touring car was only a few yards away when it passed slowly on Massachusetts Avenue. I hadn't been politically engaged enough, and in any event was too absorbed in my personal traumas to think much about Roosevelt's success and failures. By the mid-1930s, however, I counted myself as an irregular in the Roosevelt Legion, left of his New Deal administration and unhappy with the government's refusal to sell arms to Republican Spain, but unqualifiedly hostile to the president's enemies. He was my hero. When I saw him that day in Cambridge, my arms shot up as if some force had yanked them, and I roared a cheer. This was the man who hung like a WPA poster in the national classroom between 1933 and 1945, and who, with all of his imperfections, was by my criteria gallant and great. Most Americans didn't anticipate his quick disappearance, nor were they prepared for it. I know that I wasn't. Only later did I recall the transparency and deadly refinement of his face in his last photographs, as if he were already a half-ghost about to fly out of history. His death in April 1945 left a hole in my world that none of his successors would ever fill. I continued to serve as a foot soldier in the Truman ranks, but my enthusiasm waned after the congressional primitives and their abettors pushed through a loyalty program that seemed to people like me more threatening to American democracy than the moth-eaten remnants of the American Communist Party. I stuck to the Truman who desegregated the armed services and fired the Olympian MacArthur. Like Fiorello LaGuardia, Truman might have been the hero of an American musical comedy. His GOP detractors and Thomas Dewey, his overconfident opponent, misassessed or failed to acknowledge his Republican virtues, his uncommon commonality. It would have pleased me to meet him on one of his much-reported walks in the streets of New York, to greet him as Mr. President, to ask if I might join the little gang that accompanied him, to raise a point or two in American history, and perhaps even venture a disagreement. If he didn't have a rich and copious mind or radiate nobility, he encouraged a trust in Herman Melville's great democratic God, who had picked Harry Truman from the pebbles and hurled him into the White House. Of all the presidentiads I lived through and studied, the most prime for tragedy seemed to me that of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Like Faulkner's Thomas Sutpen and Absalom Absalon, LBJ was a powerful and potentially good man, riddled with flaws, brought down by stubborn pride and blindness to portents. He was also, and I believe sincerely so, a legatee of FDR and closer than his master to the experiences of the poor and ground down, whose problems he felt obliged and competent to remedy. LBJ quit his office a wounded Titan, hurt and bewildered by his repudiation. I had only an inkling of the person in the towering frame whom I had once hailed and then turned against, but I still resented the smart-ass baiters who, when it was safe, mauled the dead lion. In the early 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy hung over the United States like an enormous painted balloon. Watching his scowly, bristly face on television had been pretty scary. The liberal press was full of stories about the lives he had wrecked, and the extent of the damage he caused has yet to be measured. There is no doubt that he brought out the worst in the worst, but he was a bugaboo of less substance than he appeared to be at the time, and in retrospect was more of a clown. The GOP leaders who feared him and who despised his ragtag entourage without discouraging their tactics were more sinister than the jolly blackguard himself.
This passage is from Dan's Commonplace book. He read it to me in his office a few years before it was published, and it has stayed with me, as so many other things about Dan have as well. New Year's Day, 2000. I didn't think I could live this long, impossibly distant when I began to think of futurity. And it is a long time between 2000 and 1912. If you think of history as a train ride through familiar, if ever-changing landscape, I've been a passenger for close to 90 years, missing most of the scenery, but halted at points in the journey and given the opportunity to look around. Had I been less self-centered and more curious and detached, I would have had a denser story to tell. Still, I like the image of one's human span as a train ride. Note, not a journey, not a search, not extra-natural. At a never recoverable point, you find yourself on that train. You ride and get to know some of the passengers encountered on what used to be known as the observation car. That figure or object seems appropriate to me because my first vivid encounter with life, reality, was on the train ride from Chicago to Los Angeles in 1917 with my parents and siblings. That train ride and others to follow were correlatives of domestic instability. During this long trip, there are many hellos and goodbyes, some epiphanic, some wrenching, but most unintense. Not many people worship at the altar of the dead. Time is less an anodyne than a narcotic. I imagine my end at a train stop. I put on my coat, the night will be wet and foggy, and pick up my suitcase, a small one, and smile at passengers who haven't yet arrived at their destination and step across the empty platform.
Hi, I'm the last reader, and so for brevity's sake, I am going to dispense with the excerpt from American Notes. Also, it messes up the chronology, and just read two pieces from Dan's Commonplace book. So I met Dan about 10 years ago through the Society of Fellows, and we became very close friends when he was already in his 90s. So I feel like I've been dreading the occasion for this gathering for a long time, but it's so nice to see Dan's family and so many of his friends all together here tonight. So the first thing I'll read is called Story Idea, plot for Cambridge series called Tales for Children. An emeritus professor owns an ancient Raleigh bicycle purchased at the end of World War II. It is still functioning a decade later, but barely. Parts are hard to find. The fenders are beginning to bend and twist. He takes the bike to the repair shop and is advised not to spend his money trying to fix it. By the way, the professor happens to be an atheist. He feels sad about the bike, which is now positively dangerous to ride. He's really depressed, takes it personally. The dying bicycle signifies the end of himself and his world. One night, moved by some strange impulse, he descends into the basement of his house to inspect the injured bike and finds it miraculously restored, glitteringly healed, metal fatigue gone. Overjoyed, he takes the bike out. As he turns the pedals, perfume sprays out the bell on the handlebar and music from the brake. Shaken, the professor stops at a pub on Massachusetts Avenue for a drink. A thief hops on the unwatched bike, but lo, the bike cries out, "Stop this thief, he's stealing the property of my master." Clearly a miracle. A policeman apprehends the thief just as the old professor, who has heard the call and hurried to the rescue, arrives. Now he realizes that he has been wrong about religion, that the bike is a sacred bike and ripe for canonization. People come to his house to pray to the bike, which performs some modest miracles. Nothing astonishing, but sound cures. The professor dies content. He knows that the bike will be enshrined in the Bow Street Church. A thought on the dead. A dead man is alone when he is dead, and more alone when he is forgotten. I should like to renew my friendship with the dead, to think of them frequently and to speak to them. And I should like people to think of me in that way when I am dead. I hope I shall be available to my children and to my surviving friends, and they will think of me in a friendly way when they are having a good time.
Dan's voice, I'm sure we all agree, is inimitable. No matter how much everything Dan wrote from the observation car has us focused on the objective attention of his attention, nonetheless, we can also always simultaneously be conscious of the play of Dan's smile, of the usually bridled trenchancy of his judgment, and of the breadth of his sympathy. So thank you to all our readers for bringing Dan so sharply, beautifully, movingly back to life, and thanks to each of you for sharing this moment with us. Thank you.